we're going to start with. What if Ben Johnson leaving and the overall coaching brain drain actually does begin to have a massive negative impact on the efficiency of the Lions offense? Because we'll talk about here in a second, Boone, like nobody is viewing it that way based on rankings right now.
Well, you said you feel bad that this is my first episode and this is the topic here, but I was super pumped when you brought this topic up because the team here, the Lions that we're starting with, this is something I had been thinking about well before you suggested this as the topic. So I really wanted to jump on and go through this. And I think everybody's talked about the Ben Johnson thing all off season long. So yes, that is going to be massive. I mean, him leaving, whenever you lose one of the best offensive coordinators, it's going to be a problem. I think maybe one that they could overcome if it was just that by itself. But I think there are so many things going on in this Lions franchise right now that could be a problem fantasy wise. And I always want to make the distinction between like real life and fantasy, that they're definitely, sometimes people are too focused on one or the other. You kind of got to blend them both a little bit. And sometimes they are completely separate. You could have, a terrible real life scenario and yet still be putting up really good fantasy stats. The Lions are still going to be a good team. I don't think we're suggesting that today, that they're going to completely fall off and finish near the bottom of the league or anything like that. They are still going to be a good team, but you're losing Ben Johnson, who has really made that offense one of the best offenses in the league. They have the talent. They had the coordinator. Now he's gone. And maybe John Morton is going to be able to step in there and take over. I think there's going to be a bit of a step back with him. But to me, it's all the factors involved. It's losing their all-pro center and Frank Ragnow to retirement. That happened more recently. But on top of that, they also lost Kevin Zeitler, right? Who's been a quality lineman for years, who has been a really good guard, played excellent for them last year. A Pro Football Focus, they ranked him, they graded him out as their third best guard last season. That's a huge loss. For the record, Frank Ragnow, I think, was the second graded center by them. So these are top linemen. So now you're going to have a situation in the interior of that offensive line where you're going to have at least two new starters. Maybe Graham Glasgow is going to move to center. We'll see what happens there. But you have an offense that has really been able to kill people with the run and really done it thanks to that offensive line. That's been a huge help for them. And that offensive line has also kind of insulated Jared Goff. And I think Jared Goff is the kind of quarterback that needs that kind of perfect scenario around him in order to hit his ceiling. And he had it. He had the coordinator. He had the line. He had the talent. Well, now we have questions about the line. Now we have questions about the coordinator. I'm going to stop there because I have a few other things I want to bring up, but I'm going to give you a chance to hit on those two first, because those are really, really big ones that are going to have an impact on these guys.
Well, I thought you made a really good point there about how there's a difference between having a good real life season and a good fantasy season. And I actually think that's super instructive with the Lions in particular, because I actually think they could all of this stuff could cause them to take a step back as a team, but they could actually then end up being, I won't say it's like a better environment for fantasy, but if the schedule is harder, if they're not leaning on teams with the run game quite as much, because of the offensive line turnover. And again, just because they're not like blowing teams out of the water like they were at times last year, do they then have to throw the ball a little bit more? And does that become like actually a boost for a guy like a Jameson Williams or a Sam Laporta? Maybe some of these like not ancillary, but like the secondary wide receivers and tight ends in this environment here. So again, it like one negative doesn't have to lead to another negative. It can actually lead to like a weird positive for fantasy, but that's like a little bit kind of esoteric and like very small lens. Like I do want to just look at this big picture here, because I think the tough part with this conversation, Boone, is that we don't have a lot of examples of what this looks like in recent years, where a team loses an inner circle offensive coordinator, like one of the top 5 or so play callers in the game. Because for the most part, the top 5 play callers in the game are all head coaches, right? They're Sean McVay, they're Andy Reid, even a guy like Matt LaFleur, like they're not going anywhere, right? So we don't have a lot of examples of this. I actually think the most recent example, or at least the best example in my mind, and people can correct me if they can find another one, I thought like the 2016 to 2017 Atlanta Falcons were a really good example of what we're looking at here to sort of table set what it looks like when you lose a top 5 play caller, because they had Kyle Shanahan that year. We know they went to the Super Bowl. We know what happened when they went to the Super Bowl, but they were an incredible offense that year in 2016. They ranked first in EPA per play, third in success rate, first in explosive play rate, and first in points per game. So obviously Kyle Shanahan takes a job as the 49ers head coach. It was Steve Sarkisian that took over as the offensive coordinator in 2017 for the Falcons. It wasn't terrible. They were 6th in EPA per play, 3rd in success rate, 3rd in explosive play rate, but they were 13th in points per game. So that's sort of like when we're talking about Ben Johnson in particular leaving, we're looking at something like that, right? Where maybe this offense is still very good, but it's not one of the absolute best in the league, which, again, just to read off the metrics for the Lions last year, 3rd in EPA per play, 1st in success rate, 2nd in explosive play rate, and 1st in points per game.
Yeah, and you never know. We're going to talk about a team a little bit later, I think, that I had a lot of concerns about when they lost their coordinator last year and thought there would be a big drop-off. And then they managed to find another guy who stepped in and kept the offense just humming along, if not, maybe even made it a little bit better. So it's always possible. But again, for me, I always look at these things like they're each an individual data point. And if you just have one of them, maybe we can push it to the side. But when you have a bunch, that's when it starts to become a problem. And that's when I think there could be a little more predictability in that. So another thing I wanted to bring up here, and I don't see people talking about this enough, is their strength of schedule. And this is in real life and in fantasy. And I bring it up because it's top of mind. Like I said, I just wrote a bunch of strength of schedule stuff recently. I do it every year. And I really think this could be a problem for them. And if you want to go real life, I mean, Warren Sharp does a really good job with that, and he has them as, I believe, the 3rd hardest schedule this year overall. If you want to look more at fantasy-wise and what I've done with it, last year had a pretty friendly string of opponents there. I mean, they were top 10 at 3 different positions when it comes to my strength of schedule matrix. And Jared Goff had a fantastic season. When I'm talking about Jared Goff hitting his ceiling, I think he might have hit it last year, right? QB 8 in fantasy points per game, had the 9th easiest schedule. And for me, I always say there's a chart. If anybody checks out that matrix, you want to look at it. You want to look at the guys that are in green at the top and the guys that are in red at the bottom. The yellow in the middle, it's not really going to matter too much. So you focus on the tops and the bottom and the extremes there. And again, don't overweight that. It's just one more data point. It's good as like a tiebreaker or something to keep in mind. But now we switch to this year, and things are going to be a lot different for him. He has the 5th toughest schedule for quarterbacks. The Lions running backs have the worst schedule fantasy-wise across the league for running backs. Oof. And then the other thing that factors into some of that, last year, okay, do we recall what happened with their schedule last year? They had this bizarre setup where they only had 3 outdoor games. They didn't have their first outdoor game until week 9. And let's look at Jared Goff a little bit here. I mean, he has like a 5 to 6 point difference in fantasy points per game when we're talking about indoor and outdoor games in his career. There is a serious difference there. So now we look at this season, and man, 4 of their first 7 are going to be outside. 2 of their first 3 are going to be outside. I think they have 6 games outside in total. So that's yet another one. And okay, again, do we want to, maybe hedge a little bit and say, well, maybe this team's become a little more resilient over the last few years under Dan Campbell. They kind of have that attitude. Maybe, but now we're really stacking things up together here. I think the fact they're going from one of the easier schedules to now one of the tougher schedules, I think that is going to be a problem too.
I think this, again, it's such a good point because like it's one thing to focus on the Ben Johnson of it all and the changeover there. And we'll come back to that, but I love the point about there's multiple things happening here where it's not just, yes, you got turnover on the offensive line, which look, we in fantasy focus on Amon-Ra St. Brown and Jahmyr Gibbs and all these playmakers and stuff like that. And yeah, again, Ben Johnson, a great play designer from a pass game standpoint, like their pass concepts and the way they're like the routes all work together and the spacing and how condensed it is and how they're able to attack all blades of grass. That's great. But this team is built on being badass up front, right? They're a physical run team. They're a run team that runs a lot of concepts. Like they pull guys, they'll pull Penei Sewell. They'll do all kinds of stuff like that. And when you lose Frank Ragnow in the middle, that's a huge part of it. And again, how many, if this team is playing more outdoor games, and right, they play in Green Bay in week 1, they play in Baltimore in week 3, they play in Cincinnati in week 5, they play in Kansas City in week 6. That's not like not only are those games all outside, those are all pretty tough opponents too in a whole nother lens of it as well. how many of those teams are they, and how many games this year are they just going to be able to lean on teams with that ground game, which, like I said, maybe that does open up opportunities, more targets and things like that, more pass attempts for Jared Goff, more targets maybe for a Jameson Williams, or more targets maybe for an Amon-Ra St. Brown. But are those targets going to be as efficient? Because like we think about this from a fantasy perspective, like, oh yeah, we want quarterbacks who throw the ball a lot. You actually want quarterbacks to be efficient. You want them to be in positive game script, because then they're not like throwing aggressively. They're not making mistakes. And again, this could all just be like a cascading effect here. So like, you're right. It's not just the fact that they've lost a play caller, which is kind of the ethos of the show, but it's all these other things that are also in play with the Lions that make it like, again, nobody's adjusting for any of this. Boone, right? Like Jahmyr Gibbs is the running back 3. He's the 6th overall pick in drafts right now. St. Brown is wide receiver 6. He's the 9th overall pick in drafts right now. Jameson Williams, wide receiver 27. Dave Montgomery, running back 23. Sam Laporta, tight end 4. Jared Goff, QB 13. Like, people are expecting this to be one of the best offenses in the league again, and to provide a very fruitful fantasy environment. But there's a lot of things to consider here, and that's what we're doing here, right? We're take shopping. We're contrarian cornering this whole thing.
Yeah, and looking at some specific guys like you're doing there, Jared Goff, obviously, I've said my part about him. I have him further down my rankings than I think most people do. The other guy that I'm curious about that this could really impact is David Montgomery. And we've seen them have 2 very productive running backs for fantasy the last several seasons. But last year, we saw something kind of change there, right? Like David Montgomery, his carries per game went down by, I think, almost 2.5 carries per outing. That's pretty significant. Now, he made up for it with a little more receiving work, and obviously he always has the touchdown thing going on, and that kind of helps him fantasy-wise, but touchdowns can be volatile. And if we're talking about this team maybe not scoring as much or not being in those kind of positions as often, could he be the guy that really gets hurt here? He's somebody that I feel like every time I'm updating my projections and my rankings, I bump him down a little further. And right now I have him in that like fringe low end RB2 range kind of, but he could be like a high end RB3 or more of a touchdown or bust kind of flex play. I could see that totally happen if this offense takes a step back.
Right. He was running back 13 in points per game last year. He missed a few contests at the end of the season, which really then boosted Jahmyr Gibbs up. And man, as somebody that had Jahmyr Gibbs on a lot of fantasy teams last year, it wasn't the worst time in the world to have that happen, right? You know, I never wish injuries on players, but obviously that, again, Jahmyr Gibbs really smoked at the end of the season. So Montgomery, though, I guess we're already kind of baking in a step back from him, but he is somebody, man, over the last few years I've drafted a lot of, because as much as we talk about, Montgomery misses time, Jahmyr Gibbs gets a big boost. The same is true for Montgomery, right? Like if Jahmyr Gibbs ever missed time, Montgomery would probably become an instant, top 12, top 10 weekly ranked back if this environment is still one of the best in fantasy, Justin. And I guess that's kind of the where we're at here. Like, what do we think of John Morton taking this team over? Because like John Morton's an interesting character, right? He actually he played in the CFL as a wide receiver. I don't know if you knew that, but he was a wide receiver. At least he was on the roster of the Argonauts. So like, there's that. But he actually has called plays in the NFL before. He was the offensive coordinator with the New York Jets in 2017. That was like an interesting offense because it was Josh McCown like throwing the ball all over the yard. He was Robbie Anderson at the time, I believe, but now Robbie Chosen averaged almost 15 yards per catch, scored 7 touchdowns. Jermaine Kearse went over 800 yards in that offense. Bryce Petty started 3 games. That's not great. And they ultimately were the 32nd ranked offense in success rate that year. So I don't know if we know anything about John Morton other than he has a really interesting background and that he's like been with Sean Payton for a while. He's kind of off the same tree as Ben Johnson, even spent time with the Lions as a senior offensive assistant in 2022. So this is the whole point of the show, right? Where throughout the course of the offseason, I've said like, I'm not too worried about the Lions because really, like, I think people are underrating how much of an offensive background Dan Campbell has. You know, he was a tight end in the NFL. He was an offensive coach under Sean Payton. Like, people think of him as just this, almost think of him as like a defensive coordinator because he's big and he has like that bravado. He doesn't look like the hotshot offensive coordinators, but he does have an offensive background. But again, I'm trying to check my priors here, Boone, where that's what I've said all offseason. But it is worth looking at the other side of it. And again, if these other factors also come to play and we just don't have that good of an offensive environment, we could be looking at like some potential misses here among Lions skill position players.
And maybe we should give Dan Campbell and company a little bit of credit, because all along the way, people have doubted them, right? When he brought in a lot of coaches that were former players and didn't necessarily have like serious coaching backgrounds, people doubted that too. And it's worked out pretty well for him. So maybe he'll hit on another one here. But I just keep coming back to the Jared Goff aspect and what a tough act this is going to be to follow for Morton, because Jared Goff had Sean McVay and Ben Johnson, who really got the most out of him in his career. And how on earth do you match what those guys have done, right? It's not impossible, but the odds of him coming anywhere close to what those two guys did with Jared Goff, I think that's a serious problem. And maybe you like Goff more than I do. We talked briefly about this at one point in our call a couple weeks ago, that I think you had Jared Goff ranked pretty highly when you were looking at the top quarterbacks in the league. Again,
instant regret, by the way. Instant regret. That was one where I was like, maybe should have had Stafford over. Like, if I was starting a franchise, would I really take Jared Goff over Matthew Stafford, even if for just this year? I don't know if I'd do that. So again, a little bit of regret on that one, but yes, nevertheless, could continue.
Well, and Jared Goff, the fact that he was the QB8 in average fantasy points per game last year, and the type of quarterback that he is, right? We don't see a lot of quarterbacks who are pocket passers end up in that range unless they have huge touchdown totals and huge yardage totals. The rushing quarterbacks just crush those guys now, right? Like on average, you do not have many of those pocket passers end up in the top 10, the top 12. So I think with all these changes, it's going to be very difficult for Goff to get up there. And then that just trickles down to the entire offense.